sessions are coordinated by myself. I'm Erin Bunting from Michigan State University. This is Jane Southworth from University of Florida, Hannah Herrero from University of Tennessee. And so the topics today, big data, GeoAI, redefining landscapes, and that's going to be our topic for our tomorrow as well. So we have 5 speakers in our session, and for our speakers, microphone obviously, and I've been told a clicker is coming to help you forward through the slides. So thank you so much for your patience. We appreciate you sticking around, and we'll start here shortly. Our first speaker, I think we are set to go, Jane Southworth from the University of Florida, speaking on a paper on machine learning, GeoAI, remote sensing, all that good stuff.
Okay, I'm loud to begin with, sorry about that. I'm going to talk today on a paper that we have published that's a review paper looking at machine learning versus deep learning within land system science. We are going to go, there we go, quickly, because we are already 30 minutes in. So obviously we all know that within land system science, a lot of the questions we're asking have become increasingly complex, and the data sets available to us are all equally complex. So because of this, a lot of people have been looking at different methodologies, integrating different data systems, data fusion within land system science. And I have a lab of graduate students who think techie is good and deep learning is better. And I say no, maybe, but you need to show me it's better. So we basically started doing a review. So this whole thing is a review from the literature in land system science. Oh, I don't know where I'm pointing. Okay, so we all know most of the literature within land system science itself. Obviously, we're looking at human-driven changes in land system, and specifically for this research, we're looking at the use of remote sensing in answering questions within this GeoAI framework. There's been an explosion of data, I think we all know that, data systems, different scales, different resolutions, and so the integration of a lot of those data sets has become an area of focus within the remote sensing research. What my issue is frequently that people use the newest tool and the techiest tool, and perhaps not always the best tool. And by best, I don't just mean the score that they get or the accuracy assessment, but the best for the system that they're studying and the resources that they have available to them. And especially within this kind of theme of sustainability, there's a lot of issues with sustainability when we get into big data and deep learning. There we go. So what we decided to do was basically develop a framework that we call the competency framework, looking at a decision tree tool that could help guide people on when they might go a machine learning versus a deep learning route. And we based the entire study on literature that had already been published with people using machine learning and deep learning on questions in land change science. So this framework was basically looking at different criteria, which I'll mention in a minute very briefly, and looking at those conditions where the outcome would be a deep learning model versus a machine learning model. These are the different criteria that we looked at. If you read the paper, 80% of the paper is discussing these criteria. So here I'm just going to briefly mention them, that we're obviously interested in. The number one question in land system science is, what's your question? What is the system under study, and what is the data available to you? Then within that, what is the time period of study, and what data do you have about the ground itself, be it training data, validation data, depending on the system you're looking at. However, if you're going into the world of deep learning and machine learning, you've also got a lot of technical needs and competences that you as a researcher must have, but also access to resources that you also need. The mood lighting has come on. We're now going into the evening portion of the day. So much easier to see there, thank you. So now we're going into the different types of technology that you must have access to as a researcher, which depending on where you work and what resources you have available may be a considerable constraint. Sorry, every time I press, it takes a while. There we go. So I mentioned it's a review paper. So these are just 2 examples of the tops of each table that make up the majority of the research. So the first table is looking at different machine learning and deep learning papers, what they did, the question they asked, the time period, the data they used, and so forth, all within land system science. The second table on the right is only looking at 29 researchers that we found where within the same study, they did both machine learning and deep learning on the same exact question with the same exact data. So they could actually compare the accuracy and the value gained of using those more advanced approaches. I really need to start just pressing early. There we go. So this is what we're looking at within each of our criteria. We designed basically for each of them, and I'll pull it all together in one figure at the end, and I'm going to go through this section very briefly just because of time. But we looked at different sets of the criteria that we mentioned from the literature and kind of pulled out which route would take you to a machine learning versus a deep learning outcome. So here it's just your level of expertise within different types of data processing, feature extraction, algorithms, and frameworks. Obviously, the machine learning algorithms being much simpler. Then this one is simply for computing requirements. If we're doing deep learning, I think anyone who's run it knows oftentimes you're looking at using hypercomputers or very significant software. And all the numbers and all of this data is straight from the research article, so if interested, you can go find that. Trying to turn the slide. There we go. So this one here is putting it all together. So this is basically the finding of the paper from all the research articles that are done. And you'll see that at almost every level, there's an output that sends you to machine learning. And it's only when you go through all 4 sets of criteria boxes that you're going to end up with a deep learning approach. Because the limitations are so significant when doing deep learning, specifically the data required, the expertise required, the computing resources required. And honestly, in a lot of the studies, the accuracy improvement was not great. The maximum improvement we found in most of our studies was around 10%, but most were around 2 or 3%. But the level of data accuracy of their input data wasn't necessarily at a level where a 2 or 3% difference was really worth all that extra investment. More specifically, they were rarely ever able to do time series analysis. They simply didn't have the data for those earlier dates to really build and to develop the models at the level they did. So most of the deep learning models were single date, high resolution imagery, and looking at very specifically complicated landscapes for those single or very recent multiple dates, as opposed to a time series analysis that might go back to the 80s. In terms of areas of growth, obviously machine learning is a massive field, as is GeoAI, and this is a really good book for anyone who's interested, put out by the National Academy. But in terms of the things that people are looking at to try and improve this machine learning versus deep learning conversation, it's really looking at data integration and data fusion approaches. Semi-supervised and unsupervised learning is huge because you can then train your data much better, so you don't have to rely all the time on those original data sets, allowing you to be much more efficient in your use. Interpretability and trust is a massive issue, especially with deep learning models. You'll hear them referred to as black box, depending on the type of model people are using. If you're working with communities, it's a very hard time to explain what you're doing if you have a black box model. There are issues there in the field, and not just in other countries. In the US, it's also an issue. So a lot of trust, a lot of transparency issues with using some of these more advanced techniques actually meant that a lot of the researchers turned away from them, that lack of explainability. Being able to use models to transfer across regions is huge. We all know we often train a model in one site, and then we use that same model somewhere else. That's a huge problem with a lot of these advanced methods. It's a lack of transferability. You're basically starting over every time. So again, in terms of efficiency and sustainability and resources available, it can be a huge problem. And then finally, just integrating, looking at real-time monitoring, it can be problematic with some of these just because of the data needs. I'm just trying to go onto a slide. There we go. And so the final slide, just looking at this in terms of trying to pull it together, is deep learning may get you a slightly improved accuracy if you have all of the data available, but it is a question oftentimes with your research area of whether that is worth it, especially in terms of loss of explainability and transparency of your results when working with people on the ground. So there's a lot of challenges within this area. I'm sure we'll see a lot of people using a lot of these techniques, but the data needs and the computing needs are restricted for its use for a lot of these more advanced methods. They simply just aren't available to a lot of researchers. So a lot of things are trying to combine, look at these interdisciplinary teams, looking at specialists and domain experts across machine and deep learning areas, pulling them in together, and also trying to consider much more upfront some of the ethical implications of using some of these methods. We know that anything with data bias in it will be reinforced within your model significantly, so you really have to be careful when you apply some of these models to human-based systems. So really trying to look at some of the benefits of this are huge, but we really still need to work on developing this. And the whole point of this paper was so that I could tell my students, well, you know, you did a paper that looked at that, and there really wasn't a lot more gain for you to actually use deep learning over machine learning and the specific question you have. And I'm happy to report they're all still doing deep learning. They just do machine learning too now, to prove it to me. But yeah, okay, and I'm gonna end there. But this is published, so if people are interested in some of the details, you can go look at the research article. Thank you.
Given the time limitations, I think we're going to hold off on questions until the end of the session. And our speakers, if you could hang around at the end, I would appreciate that, so if there are questions. Next up, we have Jumi Gogoi from the University of British Columbia. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So starting with a bit of a background to the research. So just waiting for the slide to Okay, there we go. In the Canadian agricultural space, over time, there has been a lot of crop yield models which have been developed using coarser spatial resolution data. So for example, so in the Canadian sector, so this is one crop yield model which has been developed by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the integrated Canadian crop yield forecaster, which basically has been developed using a very coarse resolution yield data set. As you can see, it's a very coarse resolution scale, like spread over huge agricultural regions. And it also takes in a legacy satellite data product, which is the 1 kilometer satellite resolution product, and also adds some satellite data to it. And in terms of performance of this model, we see that at 1 month lead time before harvest, there is a huge range of error across the agricultural region, just prompting that there is a huge range of improvement that can be done in this agricultural space. And recently, due to opening up of the provincial crop yield data archives, we've also been able to develop municipality scale models using like different satellite products. We've used the legacy MODIS data product, and we've brought in Lancet, different indices, developing a single index model, a multi-index model, and you see that the performance still varies across the spatial scale in the prairies. But due to adoption of precision farming in the Canadian prairies, we see there is a huge amplification of data volume. And by that I mean when we move from a municipality scale to a field scale, where we just had one crop yield observation per year for each municipality, at the field scale, at the point lat and longitude resolution, we have more than 13,000 yield observations for 1 year and one crop field. And this is just for one field. And even when we increase the resolution to 30 meters to match Landsat, we see that there are more than 1,000 observations, again, for that same field and same year. And it's not just data volume that we see, there is also a big increase in data variety. So we not only have the yield data from the combine harvesters, we also have some environmental data such as elevation. And when the combine records more information, we also have some more information such as seeding rate and soil conductivity maps. So leveraging these data products, what we have been able to do is, for one crop farm in the prairies, just waiting for it to show up. Oh. There you go. So for one farm in the prairies, as you can see here, we use subfield level yields for 3 crop types. These are the primary crops grown in the Canadian prairies, and we had yield data for 6 years. And that gave us about, at 30 meter resolution, because of the time period we had to match it to the Lancet resolution, we had about 100,000 yield observations for each crop type. And on the predictor side, we had the Landsat indices. So we had extracted indices that tracked biomass, chlorophyll, and water content in crops. And we also had the weather variables, which we derived from the DMET product, which is available across North America. And we also had some elevation data from the farmer, from the combine harvester. And because we had an increase in data volume and variety, we brought in deep learning methods, that is deep neural networks, and we also brought in convolutional neural networks. And also we had some baseline machine learning, random forest, and XGB models, and the benchmark linear regression, stepwise linear regression model. And these combination of models were run on different combination of on predictors, as you can see on the right bottom. We ran it on the benchmark satellite data product, and we also combined it with like different satellite and environmental predictors. And what we saw in terms of performance was that combining diverse inputs improves yield estimation. So basically, when we moved from a single type feature space, this is, for example, a random forest model for the barley crop. So when we moved from a single type feature space to a multiple feature type space, we saw an improvement of about 1% when we brought in weather. And when we introduced, the arrows have gone a bit wayside, sorry about that. So when we brought in more features, we combined elevation, we saw another improvement of 1%, so a total improvement of about 2%. And in terms of competitiveness of data-driven models, we found that machine and deep learning models overall had a performance improvement of 5 to 7% over traditional linear regression models. And the random forest model came out to be the best performing model across all crop types. I'm just going to speed up. So, and in terms of capturing historical yield variability, we find that across time, those are the years missing yield data from the farmer. We see that the model was able to capture the spatio-temporal yield variability. And in terms of capturing the spatial variability within a field, the model was able to mimic the actual observed yield across the field. And in terms of the overall field scale prediction error, the error ranged between 6 to 11%. And in terms of features driving the performance of the random forest model, we see that the weather-based variables are the top performing drivers. And this, if you remember from Meha Jain's talk earlier in the morning, she showed a crop phenological growth curve where basically the weather drives the growth of the crop. So that's why these predictors have been ranked as like the top predictors in all our crop types in this particular model. But however, the main utility of these models are in basically the forecasting skill when we apply for deriving in-season like forecast of crop yields. And we see that for canola and wheat, the harvesting the model error sort of stabilizes 3 months before harvest. So the vertical line is the median harvest date. And in terms of field scale performance, we see that there is a bit of like at the farm scale, we see a bit of like variability in terms of the performance across the years. However, we found that with the barley model, the model performance stabilizes only 15 days before harvest. So there is still room for improvement with this particular model. And similarly at the field scale, at the farm scale. So some key takeaways, we see that at a subfield scale, increasing input data variety leads us from a higher error to a lower error, that is going from a satellite to an integrated input space. And then we see that bringing in machine and deep learning also leads to a lower error. Yeah, we see an improvement of about 5 to 7% when we move from a linear regression to a non-linear machine or deep learning space. And then in terms of the optimal performance of the model for forecasting, we see that, let's wait for the clicker to turn up. There. So the optimal model is basically a combination of machine and deep learning methods and integrated inputs, and it lies in that space where we get a forecast within 3 months of lead time before crop harvest. And in the future, when more subfield level yield data sets become available, we'll be able to sort of refine the model forecasting quality of these kind of models. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as mentioned, we're going to hold questions till the end. Thank you. All right, our next speaker, and we have slides up, great. Christopher Stevens from Universidad Nacional. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I have a lot of animations, so given that it takes 3 seconds for everything to pass to every other thing, I don't know if I'll get a little bit of extra time because of that. There we go. So when Alexander the Great visited the oasis of Siwa in Egypt, he wanted to ask 2 questions. And one of them was that, will I conquer the entire world? Obviously, he got the answer yes. But the thing is that he didn't ask any follow-ups that we would think of as being important, like when would he do it, where is the known world, the entire known world, where, or more importantly, how, or potentially counterfactuals, what would be the probability that he wouldn't conquer the known world. Oracles are obviously very useful things if they can give you some good, accurate answers that you can test against data, right? Obviously, he tested against his data eventually by saying that he did conquer the world. But basically, if we think of problems in land science, for instance, how much deforestation, when we reach a tipping point for melting of the Greenland ice sheet, what is this object in my remote sensing data? That's obviously a huge topic for deep learning and things like that. But what I'll show is that, well, okay, there are more important things, as we'll see. Who is most responsible for the deforestation in a given place? That's something I'll address in the sense of thinking about government programs that have one purpose in mind that unfortunately end up having a completely different effect. And we can think about what the present day oracle is. There. One of the problems with an oracle, unless you can ask it many other questions, is it just spits out an answer and you go, well, I'm happy with that answer. Well, the answers to all those questions are all predictions, right? So why is that important? So you see what I was saying. The point would be is that it's no use having an answer to a question where the question wants to lead you to making, let's call it, a better world. So what do we mean that? So in other words, what can we do about it? So if I wanted to say a chief take-home point for everything, not just land system science, but your lives personally and professionally, it's this. It's the idea that if we want to make a better world, we can only do it by taking certain appropriate actions. We can only take those actions based on appropriate decisions. But the thing that I want to emphasize, there does not even exist the concept of a decision without the concept of a prediction behind it. If you want to think, every organism is just basically a set of prediction models, right? Every one of us is just a big set of prediction models. And then the question is, how good is your prediction model? So basically, human intelligence is just based on the notion of a human classifier. We see things, we take in data, and we go, that's dangerous, that's good, that's bad, that's tasty, that's etc., etc. That's how we work. And the thing is, we can't make a decision without thinking about having the data that goes into the prediction model. But is a huge topic of many of the presentations here in this conference, we're now living in a world where 99.999% of all data in this planet is not in these things, like it was about 40, 50, 60 years ago, but it's in these things that we're all carrying around. And the thing is, as I like to say sometimes, we don't speak database. And even if we did speak database, each one of us can only process symbolic data at about 50 bytes per second, right? So that's about as many words as you can read in a second. So therefore, there's no alternative but to using artificial intelligence. And this is like trying to get blood out of a stone. To basically combine, but at the end of the day, independently of how we combine the two different intelligences, it has to give us an appropriate Okay. What I want to try and at least have 1 minute to get over is that what we have, we've developed in my groups at the Center for Complexity Science, is what we think of is a hammer, where if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What I want to think of is that we've got a fairly universal system of creating Bayesian classifiers on top of data of absolutely arbitrary data type, arbitrary data resolution, etc., etc. So what are the steps that we go through? Joven, ¿puedes regresar uno, por favor? Ya, déjalo ahí, porfa. So first of all, we have to ask a question just like at the Oracle at Siwa, right? What do I want to know? And so the thing is, I'm going to just plant one question here. Where is the deforestation, or where will there be deforestation? And how intense will it be, right, for instance? And we're going to ask that. If we're asking where and when, we need to make a partition, a spatial and temporal partition. So we do that, and we end up with an ensemble of cells. Then what we're going to do is a data fusion piece to bring absolutely every piece of data that we've got, doesn't matter whether it's rasters, doesn't matter whether it's point collection data, everything to the same scale, right? And there's multiple ways you can do that, right? It's basically a feature selection step if you want to put it that way. Then what we're going to do is bring everything to be a binomial variable. So if I've got annual temperature, what I'm going to do is convert it into a set of binomial variables. I can go to 20 bins, 10 bins, 500 bins, depending on how much data I have. And then we're going to be able to go to a particular cell, and we're going to be able to go, this is what's happening in that cell. This is all the data associated with that cell. So the thing is that because everything's a binomial variable, nothing is other than just presence or absence of a particular, let's call it bin of a particular variable in a particular place at a particular time. Then what we're going to do is define a set of co-occurrences. The thing that I'm interested in, predicting deforestation, say, C, and then every other last thing, and we're talking about hundreds or thousands of variables. One of the systems we have has over 65,000 variables in it, and the machinery will just churn out an answer. So the thing is that basically what we want to do is calculate these co-occurrences, and then we're going to use that to generate a Bayesian classifier at the end. Okay, so the thing is that for an example, just a pure example, so what is my ensemble? We're going to look at a scale, a heterogeneous partition, which is just Mexican municipalities, and what are my answers that I want to, the questions I want to answer. So I want to know, be able to predict where there's principal loss of forest cover in 2020, and I can ask intensive questions, because extensive and intensive is different. Where will be the highest intensity of deforestation or whatever? And what are my x, right? So I've got this P of C of x. All I'm doing is throwing in a C, throwing in an x, and then we'll throw in how do I calculate it, right? So we've got those 39 variables that cover a lot of different, let's call them ontological taxonomic areas. And the thing I want to basically mention is that how to use this for public policy, as we see the thing about Sembrando Vida. I don't know if everybody knows what Sembrando Vida is, a particular government program here for helping poor people in rural areas to basically get some money by planting a milpa or a huerta or algo or something like that. So something missing is up top. Anyway, so the thing is that we'll use a Bayesian approach, meaning, I won't go into all the wonderful advantages of a Bayesian approach. You can combine basically human intelligence with data in a very rigorous way, and you can use it to update with new data. In that sense, it's an incredibly powerful kind of conceptual framework, and it's how we think. But basically, we have a problem of how do I calculate the classifier. Well, what we're going to do is look at a partition, or let's call it a factorization of the likelihood function. And then there's two important questions there, right? One is, for a given variable, and this is where deep learning is not helpful at all. If you want to know, what do I do about this problem, less deforestation, what you need to be able to do is to go, okay, what are the principal drivers which are causing it? Is there something I can do about it, right? So there's two important factors. One is the importance of the variable, and the other is what's the statistical significance of the variable. Can you advance? ¿Puedes avanzarlo, por favor? Y sigue. Y sigue. Okay. So we're trying to build a Bayesian classifier on a 98-dimensional space. Actually, it's a 1058-dimensional space. And the criteria we want to know for every variable, I don't want to just throw them in and go, what's P or C of X? What I want to know is, for every single X, what is its importance? What is its believability, statistical significance, if it's causal or if it's actionable, right? So it's those four criteria together will tell you whether you can actually make the world a better thing using your data and your prediction model. Ya avanzas, por favor. Y sigues. Sigues. Yeah, okay. So the thing is that what you're going to get out is 1058 things that you can put in Excel, and you go, okay, how the hell am I going to make sense of that? Well, the point would be is that for in this kind of, let's call it white box way of doing things, then every single thing, you can look at it in terms of its believability, let's call it its strength, in the sense of what is it telling me about the system. And basically this, from those 98 variables, in the sense of 1058 variables, because we're doing this binomial binning, then what this is telling you is what is most associated with deforestation. And what you see is all the top variables are associated with the government program. So the thing is that, keep going, just, gracias Adrian. Sigues. What about causality? What about actionability? That's where human intelligence has to come in. Avanzas. Avanzas, 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 avanzas. In Western methodology, we have a whole array of techniques for basically determining causality. You can never determine it 100% per se, but there's statistical inference methods that have been developed in epidemiology, etc., etc. And what I want to show there, tres más, Adrián, por favor. Así es. So the point would be is that what we're talking about there is what's the probability, does everybody know what A/B testing is? What we're going to do is go to a place and go, I have factor A, factor B, and I don't have either, I have one and not the other, vice versa, etc., etc. What this is clearly telling us is that we can go to potential confounding factors one by one and go, is it the fault of sembrando vida? Oh, no, there was another factor behind it. And what this is clearly showing here, when I take another factor, which is like good climate, this bottom one is saying you've got a 45% chance of being in a municipality with the worst deforestation possible if you've got this program there and you've got good climate. But the top one is saying, what do I have if I've just got good climate and I don't have that government program and it's only 15%? So what that's telling you is what adds on top basically all the thing about, so anyway, so avanzas ya hasta el fin. The model is very good. Avanzas. And, well, yeah. So the other thing is that in this, you don't end up with just a classifier. What we have is methods to be able to predict the precise amount of deforestation. Is it 200 hectares? Is it like 5,000 hectares, etc., etc.? Because what we can do is use our classifier and use it as an input, a very highly nonlinear input, to do a regression against any continuous variable that I like, right? And there it is, and it's incredibly statistically significant, to 10 to the minus 16, and then last one, and that's it. So if you want more information, I apologize for the pathetic whatever. But the thing is that we have a very, very big group working at in the UNAM and at the Center for Complexity Science, And the people who contributed to this particular piece of work, we have about 30 papers based on this methodology in other areas, and you can either write to me or look me up or whatever, and you can get information about our projects there at the Chilam lab.
Okay, while we get the slides switched over to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Leonie Hodel from University of Wisconsin-Madison.
So, hi everyone, thanks for sticking in. I'm Leonie, I'm a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin in Madison at the Gibbes lab, and I'm going to tell you about how I use AI to count and detect cattle in the Brazilian Amazon. So, next slide. So my study region is the Brazilian Amazon, where cattle ranching is the main driver for deforestation. So in the past decade, we had an increase in pasture area of 15%. Next slide. And at the same time, the stocking rates, that means the animals of animal head per hectare, are historically low. So there's potential to increase the productivity of these pasture areas. And intensification, if done in a sustainable manner, and if you also protect the forest at the same time, has the potential to decrease the pressure on the remaining Amazon forest. Next slide. So the various policies in place that try to both address the expansion and the intensification of this issue. So we're going to see two different policies at this talk. One is the supply chain policies, the zero deforestation commitments in the cattle sector in the Brazilian Amazon, and then a public credit scheme that is trying to incentivize sustainable intensification from the Brazilian government. So this project was part of my PhD at ETH Zurich, together with Rachel Garrett and Jan Wegner and our local collaborators at Embrapa in Acre. And right now I'm working with my student, with Holly Gibbes at the GLUE Lab, and with my data science students to expand this project. So some time ago, even before I started my PhD, I was scrolling through Google Maps, and I was able to see individual cows on satellite imagery. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I want to develop a deep learning model to be able to count these cows. So then I learned that I need 30 centimeter resolution data to be able to see this, and those satellites come from either Maxar or Airbus satellites. So from a computer vision perspective, there are two main challenges. One is that these cows obviously are still very small, only a few pixels in size. And they're often appear in cattle herds, so they're very congested and conglomerated. And then also the background can be very heterogeneous. Next slide. So to account for this, for the occlusion and the conglomeration of these cows, I use a congested scene recognition deep learning model. That's a density-based convolutional neural network that has been used before to count people in crowds, and also in a small-scale study to count cattle. And it works with this concept that is called dilation, using larger reception fields in the convolutional neural network that learns the overall context of the scene. But first of all, I wanted to compare the real cattle number on the ground with the cattle that are visible on the satellite images. So I got data from the vaccination agency in Acre, Brazil, from different sites, from 21 different farms. Next slide. And the detection rate is 77%. So we'll never be able to count all cows because some of them will be hidden or under trees or under something else. So for now, I account for this with a scale factor of 1.3. I construct the training data set, cutting my images into these image tiles of 420 pixels. And then I label cattle on these image tiles. And I have around 18,000 labeled cattle in the end to be able to train my model. The model architecture is the original CSR net that I use, implemented in PyTorch, and then I also use an ensemble approach for model robustness. I have a specific test set for my model testing that was labeled by different annotators, and I use the mean absolute error as a measure, and in the end I have an error rate of 0.33 cattle per hectare. So we have a functioning convolutional neural network that counts cattle on satellite images here on panel A. And the convolutional neural network gives me out these heat maps, and I can sum up the pixel values on these heat maps, giving me the actual number of cows on this tile. So then convert that into a georeferenced data point, in that case 6 cows. And then I can do this for the entire pasture landscape. So my cattle density map has a resolution of 120 meters. And now we can predict cattle, and I do this on 170 image patches in the Brazilian Amazon for 4 different states for the years 2018-19. And in total, I count over 500,000 of cattle. Here depicted in orange, and then you see these cattle density maps overlaid with other land use maps. And in blue, you see the property boundaries, and we see that we have cattle both within properties and also outside of properties. So to address this historically low stocking rates, I then estimate the stocking rates on the property level, and I found I kind of confirmed these very low stocking rates, estimating 0.5 to 0.9 cattle per hectare across these different states. And just as a reference to, next slide. So it's estimated that the stocking rate potential is up to 4 cattle per hectare. And then we constructed a fixed effect linear regression model to compare stocking rates with other land uses. And we find that stocking rate is actually negative correlated with recent deforestation, which could be a hint to land speculation or land occupation processes. So on recently deforested areas, the number of cows are lower than on average. Just next slide. And then we also look at these 2 policies and compare it to the stocking rates, and we find that there's no significant correlation. And next slide. But the interaction terms, so in regions where we have both high CDC market share and a high allocation of these intensification credits, we see a positive correlation with stocking rates. So these areas have higher number of cows. So apart from studying cattle production systems, this method can also be used to verify already existing official data on cattle and cattle traceability systems. So we're able to also look at off-the-grid cattle production or informal or illegal cattle production. This can be interesting for the Brazilian case, but also potentially for countries where even less data is available. Next slide. So one example is cattle ranching or illegal cattle ranching in protected areas. And here you see one case study that I'm working on right now in the Gibbes lab. So this is the indigenous land called 7 de Setembro in Rondônia in Brazil. And the green part is the indigenous land, and we see that we count over 3,000 cows that are on the border of this indigenous land. And we the green areas are the properties around this protected area, and yeah, we're able to see how these cattle encroachment processes take place. So together with the Brazilian prosecutors, the MPF and the environmental police, IBAMA, we're able to use this kind of information for enforcement and take action on the ground. So going back to my model, I just wanted to point out 3 caveats. So we've seen that I always underestimate cattle numbers because they're just not visible on the images. The model is, the generalizability of the model can still be improved. And then we have this problem that the availability of this very high resolution satellite imagery is very sparse for now. Okay, next slide. I sum up. So cattle density estimations can be used to study cattle production systems, and we saw that there's a negative correlation with deforestation, and this positive correlation with the interaction term of these 2 policies. Next. Yeah, and the model can be used for various applications for monitoring and control systems. And there is a potential to expand this method to other georegions in the world. And with this, I'm done with my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, this paper is still in review, but there's a preprint available online.
Hello everyone, I'm gonna introduce myself because Erin is down there making sure that things work, so thank you Erin for doing that. My name is Herrero Carrion and I'm from Macalester College, but I'm gonna be presenting a study that I did during my PhD at the University of Florida. And thanks James for the introduction, and we have seen so far like really complex models, and today I'm particularly to the idea of like a research question and a method related to a research question. Because what I'm going to be presenting is a rather simple methodology, but that was the most useful to answer my research question. So it's up to the research questions. Next slide, please. So as a background, the tropics are greening, and I'm not going to go into detail into these articles because we're all tired and some of us a little bit stressed. But I'm just going to point out the graphs over here that are showing in positive numbers vegetation greening in the tropics. The different maps are different sources that were used, but in general we see that the tropics are greening. Next one. There are various drivers of greening. In the first map, it's the same paper, looking at the drivers, and if you can see in the tropics is in green CO2. Now, narrow it down to more sub-regional level. In the Amazon, we see that it is CO2, and it's driven by radiation in the northwestern part of the Amazon, which is the area that I'm going to be talking about. So what this means is that in the more southern part of the Amazon, the system is water limited. In northwestern Amazon, you have that a lot of greening happens during years that are quite dry because you have more radiation. But less is known about greening processes in other areas of the neotropics, and that's what I'm going to be talking about, acknowledging one paper that does look at the tropical mountain regions. So I'm going to be focusing in the country of Ecuador. Here is the location of Ecuador. Next one. And why Ecuador? Because I think it's a good case study to look into some of the details about vegetation greening at the most sub-regional level. You can see here in the elevation map that you have 3 distinct regions: the coast, the Pacific coast, the Andes in the middle, and the Amazon in the other side, more or less equally represented in area, which could be quite advantageous when you're trying to compare regions. The other map is total precipitation, and as I said, like precipitation is an important driver in vegetation greening in the Amazon, so we have contrasting precipitation regimes in the country. All the graphs around the graph show the distribution of precipitation, so those are percentages, and it serves to show the seasonality of precipitation that you can see is way more pronounced in the coast than the Amazon and the Andes are more or less in the middle. Next one. And Ecuador has also contrasting vegetation types, so it will be an interesting case study to really go from vegetation greening, which is usually assessed with different vegetation indices, to look at different vegetation types. So we have tropical rainforest in both sides of the Andes, tropical dry forest in the southern coast of Ecuador, and tropical high alpine vegetation in the Andes. So I am trying to understand with the case study of Ecuador at the sub-regional level, what are the main patterns of vegetation greening between the 1982 and 2010. Next slide. So the data that I'm using is data that has been widely used to study vegetation greening, is Gibbes NDVI data. For those of you that are not familiar with NDVI, is an index that for the purposes of vegetation ranges from 0 to 1, so the closer it is to 1, the more greening we're talking about. So there are big pixels, and what I did, I transformed this data, and I'm using two types of data. One, I have yearly NDVI, and I also have monthly triads. So these triads are kind of like running average of every 3 months. So GFM for January, February, March, average, and so on and so forth as until the last month, so 12 triads. And I also wanted to see like how I transformed the data to see how NDVI is deviated from the overall trend over the entire time series, and for that I use standardized anomalies. So the way to interpret an anomaly is pretty much the farther you are from the mean, the number of standard deviations that you are away from the mean, the more different that point in time is going to be over the overall mean. Next one. So first, what we did is to identify meaningful regions in terms of NDVI signature. I was expecting that the 3 geographic regions were going to have different signatures of NDVI, but I still did a clustering approach to see how they are, and you can look at the graph of NDVI. The Amazon obviously has the higher NDVI and the lowest seasonality, and you can see the coast slightly different than the Amazon, complete opposite seasonality, the highest NDVI at the same month that it's the lowest in the Amazon, and the Andes kind of like have the peak of NDVI in the middle. So those are the 4 subregions that we identify in terms of NDVI signature. Next one. In each of those 3, we use a time series and break point analysis, and we identify changes in significant drops in the time series around the mid-90s. That's good because that has been reported globally. So it's good that we were able to prove that with this small case study. So the important take home over here is that it seems like there are 2 distinct periods here. One is the early 90s, and the other one is the 2000s, which I'm going to be talking about later on as well, using that. Next one. I think this is the most interesting aspect of this study. So a method that is relatively simple, a regression analysis to look at seasonal shifts in NDVI. Now, if you look at this graph, you see a 0 circle in the middle. That is the slope of linear regressions. So if there were no trends in the time series, all those circles were aligned with this 0 line in the middle. The farther away you are from that, the more significant the slope of that NDVI anomaly is for that month. So that we can see here is that in the Amazon, you have significant greening started in the Triad Center in September all the way to December, which is the low precipitation season, which is something that has been reported widely for the entire Amazon. However, what I found in my study is in the other 3 areas in Ecuador, things are slightly different. And I'm still trying to understand why. So in the coast, greening happens during March to May, and it's associated with high precipitation. In the Andes are kind of like in the middle between the 2 of them. Next one. This is just a graph that I did to look at how spatially that looks like. So remember that in my time series approach, we identified breakpoints in the middle of the 90s. So here I'm comparing 1982 to 1992 period with 1997 to 2010, just looking at 2 groups and see where there is significant greening or browning So there are 12 triads over here. Provides a little bit of insights into where to look to do future studies. Next one. So going back to vegetation, this is NDVI, probably the first take home of my project. We can see that there is kind of two distinct patterns of greening on the east and the west side of the Andes. So in the east side, in the coast, and in the west Andes, if you compare the two periods, 1982, the 80s with the 2000s, we can see that NDVI greening is the result of an increase in NDVI without any shifts. In the Amazon, you see a lengthening of the growing season and a new maxima of NDVI, which is consistent with what has been found in other papers that look at the entire Amazon. Interestingly, the East Andes, which is the part of the Andes adjacent to the Amazon, kind of mimics the Amazon. So having these contrasting findings between both sides of the Andes, I think it's something interesting that deserves future research. And next and last one, so my study looking at vegetation, northwestern greening, not in northwestern Ecuador, possibly different greening patterns are up here, different to ones that have been reported. Amazon lengthening of the growing season, coast increase in NDVI, and Andes each side either mimicking the Amazon or the coast. So in the future work, I'm probably going to try to focus more on natural vegetation only, because these are very big pixels that included everything, so I understand that land cover may be an issue, particularly in coastal Ecuador that has been highly deforested. Expand to other vegetation types in northwestern South America, and use finer resolution sensor, such as Landsat and MODIS, and with that, I'll be, or will be, happy to take questions. I guess we have questions for all the speakers.
Aside from the fact we're 5 minutes into lunch, so number one, thank you. Thank you to the speakers, because that was a challenge. That's not really a fun way to give a talk, so thank you for everyone for kind of sticking with that. And likewise, thank you for the audience for sticking with that one while we all enjoyed our technological difficulties in a GeoAI talk session. Somewhat ironic, never mind, as we said, big data, main issues. So if people want to stick around, the speakers are happy to stick around for a while if people want to ask questions, but we also recognize that some of you may have already made meeting someone for lunch, so please, any questions, just go ahead and ask for any of the speakers that are in the session, but also as people drift out, don't worry, we won't be offended. We also are going to be going to the Mezcal sampling table, which is by the women's bathroom, if people have not found it yet. I was almost going to bring it in here. So we might all need one of those after this. Thank you, everyone. So any questions?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Philipp Rufin. I have just two easy questions, I guess. One is to Jane and one is to Leonie. I start with Jane. So I was wondering now, in your review, you were basically assessing the value of deep learning for pixel level land cover classification tasks, right? Yeah. But do you also explore a bit the potential in other types of applications? That would be first sub-question. Second sub-question would be, how do you see this question of accessibility in terms of technical resources, access to hardware, access to training data in the landscape of AI that is really changing fast, right? So now we have access to Google Colab for no cost. We can use these hardware resources. We can access foundation models that already are able to, predict relatively well. We can fine-tune them with less data. So things are changing quickly.
Yeah.
So how do you see that?
Yeah, we joked as soon as we published it was out of date, because just for that reason, right? But so the first one, yes, we use deep learning for a lot of examples. So we use it frequently for single date, really high complex landscapes where we have significant data. So actually agriculture, it seems to be the main one where we can get really, really good training data, especially in the US. So we've done it with almond detection in California, linking to drought and other issues where the accuracy is critical. So in those scenarios, yes, very specifically targeted using deep learning, because other ones have already not done a good job. I just think it's important to check the suite of options and not just immediately go to the most technical. In terms of accessibility, while it may be accessible in many regions of the world, I work a lot across Africa. Savanna systems and dryland ecosystems are my main study areas, and in those regions, it is not accessible at all. And it's a training. It's not even just the computing side, it's also the training and the ability to access those systems. So we're definitely spoiled with resources in many of our locations. So again, it's really nice to be able to show, and I think the second talk today, right, random forest was the best model, yeah? Which, I was like, yes. I mean, I love me a random forest. But I mean, it was, right? I mean, in comparing different ways and also integrating across machine learning and deep learning to get those. So I think it's more just a generalized approach, but it was very specific to land change science questions. Typically, time series analysis, which I think is where the biggest gap is, because you often can't get those earlier data sets. But yes, already out of date, already improving, and methods will continue to improve, but I just think it's important, especially for students, to be really researching the suite of approaches and not just jumping in on one.
Okay, quick question for Leonie. Super cool talk. Technically super sound, and nice to see the results, that this is actually working. I guess the image data constraint is a big one, so you can't do it everywhere because you don't have the image data. I was wondering something particular, because in these types of landscapes you sometimes find these secondary pastures that are basically regrowth regions where you have already kind of succession of vegetation, and then these are also used as a pasture. And just anecdotally, have you been able to detect cattle in these types of land use types? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, in areas where vegetation is growing back, and you have like small little vegetation type that sometimes even like reflect on these satellite images, and you have like white dots that look very similar to cows. And yeah, that's definitely a problem where we have to. The simplest way would be to find a way to exclude these kind of regions entirely, to be able to really focus on regions where cows are distinguishable from.
Okay, I was thinking more, in case this would work, or could already work, that you see a cow in these types of landscapes, then this would be super interesting, I guess, to many people at INPE that work, for example, on Terra Class, this product that has secondary vegetation and pasture use as one combined class, but it's kind of impossible to automate the delineation of this class because, it's just not possible with the image data that these guys use. So that could be a useful contribution of your work, basically, if you can point out where in secondary vegetation you can't find cattle. But yeah, okay.
Yeah,
long shot.
Of course.
Thank you. So I'm Adrian from University of Mexico, and a question to Leonie. So I work with charcoal that has certain similarities with what you do. And one of the problems is to integrate the temporal dimension to see how things evolve in time and then make projections into the future. So I was wondering if you include like several years or several time spans to see how the cattle numbers are changing in time.
Yes, that would be so interesting to be able to look, at intensification processes over time, for example. Yeah, give me the data and I detect the cows for you, no problem.
So the answer is there's not too many high-resolution images through a long period of time. Right?
Exactly. So that's like the biggest constraint. Like very high-resolution satellite imagery is usually task-based, so someone has to invest the money to task a satellite to take an image. And then it's coming, yeah. Well, and we just, wait a couple of years.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Marcial from the IASA Institute in Luxembourg, Austria. My question to Leonie is, I'm curious about the labeling. Like you said that the training data set was like plus 18,000 samples. So do you have like a system, or someone just was using the bounding boxes?
Was basically me during the pandemic. No, but I kind of use this like semi-supervised approach, right? So once I labeled a few cows, you can already start to predict on new images, and then you just have to correct the model. So that was like my approach to it. But yeah, it took some time.
Any other questions? All right, I know it's been said, but we really appreciate your patience in attending our session. We do have another session this afternoon in the same room with 8 speakers. So please come back and bear with us. So have a